Welcome back. I'm Janet and this is Lee, and we're here in Matthew 17 as we continue along to see what we can learn from the Gospel of Matthew together. This chapter is really interesting because it has a lot of diversity maybe in the setting. We see it starts out on a mountaintop and it goes down into some harder things as we look at these stories together. What do you notice about that as we look at just kind of what it captures in this whole chapter?
Yeah, I think the symbolism is really interesting. We talk about mountaintop experiences, and Jesus had a number of mountaintop experiences. The Sermon on the Mount was a mountaintop experience. We read about him going up on a mountain to pray all night. That's before the walking on the water and the storm at sea. And here we have Jesus at a really important turning point in his life up on a mountain. Later on, we're going to come to Jesus spending time on the Mount of Olives, and Jesus' crucifixion was on a hill, a small mountain outside of Jerusalem too. So Matthew is full of mountaintop experiences, but this chapter also includes a deep, dark valley experience. And so I think this chapter is so important to us. It reminds us that there is joy and meaning in mountaintop experiences. I guess we could, we've had them. But Jesus doesn't seem to let us stay there forever.
Yeah, Jesus doesn't even stay there himself.
Right.
Yeah, right in this chapter.
Yeah,
So we'll start off we're in verses 1 through 13. And we see this is kind of one that can be confusing for us. It feels like a mystery of sorts where it talks about Jesus was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became bright as light. What do you know of, or what does scholarship, I guess, even say about this section here?
Well, this is definitely a spiritual experience that's kind of in the category of the baptism, but it's even more difficult to understand than the baptism, which was kind of a concrete thing. Jesus went to a river, he was dunked under the water, came up, and then some amazing things happened. A voice from heaven, some visual phenomenon from heaven. And this is similar to the baptism in that we get that same voice and kind of visual phenomena occurring that signal some kind of special spiritual moment in Jesus' life. On the other hand, the transfiguration is harder for me to understand than the baptism because I don't know exactly what happened to Jesus. In this, the word implies a transformation of some kind. And so what did that involve? Biologically, I really don't know. We do have one parallel in the Old Testament, which I think is kind of interesting. It comes in Exodus 24, and it's telling the story of when Moses went up on Mount Sinai to encounter God and to be given the law and other instructions for the people of Israel who have just recently escaped from Egypt. And as he's coming down the mountain, the people look and see him coming, and it says that his face and his garments, his robes, were shining. They were glowing. And this was symbolic to him and to them of the fact that he had just had an amazing spiritual encounter with the person of the living God.
Wow.
So I assume that something like that is going on here. This is a real high moment in Jesus' earthly relationship with God, and it manifested itself in some phenomena that they could see, but I don't think we can explain.
Yeah, and we can,
Is
some
that
things
all
we
right?
can't. Yes, I think that's great for us to be reminded there is mystery in the Bible. There are things that you can't just find Lee on a Sunday and he'll explain every single detail ever. And I think there's something great about that, though, that we are reminded that we all have to be humble about that, that we just have to know that God works, and who knows how exactly that came into being, but that shows the power and mystery, the wonder that we have before God. As we look through this passage, you mentioned Moses already. we see that there appeared Moses and Elijah with him. And I think there's some symbolism from that. We've talked a little bit about Jesus being sort of the new Moses feature. So tell us a little bit more, what does it mean to you that Moses is there and that Elijah is there as well?
Yeah, there are a couple of things, a couple of interesting parallels that make their appearance important. One is that Moses, as we just mentioned, was the great lawgiver, the intermediary between God and God's people in bringing God's instructions for the way in which they were to live and worship. And so Moses represents that whole tradition of the law. Elijah, on the other hand, is one of the earliest and greatest of the prophets. And so he represents that whole prophetic tradition in which God continued to reveal God's will to the Israelite people, but this time in another form, not in law, but in prophecy, that is preaching. So Moses and Elijah, I think, represent the law and the prophets. And we've already learned from Jesus, way back in Matthew chapter 5, that he came for the purpose of fulfilling
the law and the prophets.
There you go, right. And so here we've come kind of near the middle of the Gospel of Matthew, and we get that reiterated, that the law and the prophets have kind of come together in honoring Jesus as the voice from heaven says, as the Messiah, the Son of God, my Son, the beloved, in whom I'm well pleased. I think we mentioned back when we were studying the baptism in Matthew chapter 3 that we understand the term son, and we know what well pleased means, favored. That word beloved, though, is so important because, let me just remind folks, that that phrase, my beloved son, is what Abraham used for Isaac right before he was being called on to sacrifice him. So for God to call Jesus my beloved son, there's that echo of Isaac and Abraham. In that case, Moses did not have to go through with the sacrifice of Isaac. In this case, God's beloved son
will be sacrificed.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you
go. Okay.
There's another parallel, though. You'd asked about what's with Moses and Elijah here. And so the one parallel is the law and the prophets.
Okay.
The other is that each of these Old Testament figures served as a kind of a foreshadowing of the coming Messiah. In Deuteronomy 18, there's a beautiful passage in which God says, there will arise a prophet like you who will, and goes on to describe his ministry. And that is often taken as a messianic prophecy. That is a prophecy of a coming Messiah who can be compared to Moses. Then in the prophet Malachi, the prophet says that Elijah will come before the coming of the Messiah to usher in the Messiah. Elijah will come back, as it were. So in each case, Moses and Elijah, they not only represent the law and the prophets, they together represent foreshadowings of the coming Messiah, who in this case is Jesus.
So it's making it even clearer to the disciples in this moment that this is the Messiah, that they would know that.
Well put.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right.
There's so many other things here. We see that, that they want to build tents to them, that they're afraid. There's so many other details. So as we look at the rest of this story, is there anything else that you want to point out as we unpack that more?
Yeah, Peter and the other two close followers of Jesus, James and John, they really are faithful and they try to do their best, but they frequently get confused about things. And we've already seen that, Jesus having to say, "Get behind me, Satan," because Peter was so confused about his agenda. And I think there's some confusion here too. The word tents is the same word as tabernacles.
Okay.
And tabernacle, we know, was the tent in which they worshiped God. So the word tent here doesn't just mean
Let's
place
camp,
where you go
yeah.
camping, but it refers to a shrine for worship.
Okay.
And Peter said, "Whoa! I know that something really big spiritual is happening here with God. I don't really quite know how to respond to this. Maybe the best way to do it is to set up 3 little worship sites, one for each of you." So I think that was out of his misunderstanding. The fact is, the voice from heaven corrects that and shifts the focus not from the 3 figures who are there on the mountain, but on Jesus, on the one. And so the voice doesn't talk about Moses and Elijah. The voice talks about the Son, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased. And then the voice says, listen to him, not listen to them.
It's very clear. Yeah. This is
Don't-
about Jesus. Yeah.
This is not about the law and the prophets and the Sermon on the Mount. This is about Jesus.
Yeah.
And so listen to him. And then later on, they eventually, in verse 8, I think this is real important, when they raised their eyes, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. There are 3 ways in which we're reminded that the disciples realized that their focus had to be right on Jesus and not running around and building 3 little worship shrines.
That Jesus is it. He's
Jesus,
the Messiah.
well,
Yeah.
yes, well done. Jesus is it. He does go on to say, in the light of that Malachi prophecy about Elijah coming to announce the Messiah, that Elijah, in fact, had come already.
He
and
clarifies that.
it was John the Baptist.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they've seen him. Yeah.
Yeah.
So as we look at this, it's such a unique story in the sense of, well, there's the mystery. So you said that at the beginning. What purpose do you think we're learning from this as we capture, as they capture this moment for us?
I've always had a question in my mind whether the Transfiguration was mainly an event for Jesus' benefit or for Jesus' disciples' benefit. And I think the answer to the question might be both. That this was a spiritual experience for Jesus himself, and that it, Jesus faced a lot of opposition. We just saw in our last week's lesson, the Pharisees and Sadducees who hated each other getting together to attack Jesus, and even Jesus' own followers confused frequently. And so I think Jesus, this would have been a validation to Jesus of God's continued care and love and guidance. And it's certainly for the benefit of the disciples. They have affirmed Jesus as the Son of God, but they've also balked at accepting his path toward the cross. And so this could have given them a renewed conviction that, yeah, you were right when you said he's the Son of the living God.
You're not just following some crazy man to his death. You're following the Son of the living God. Yeah.
Yeah.
I loved how at the beginning you framed this as a mountaintop experience. And that's such a good reminder for us. I think most followers have had experiences that maybe have felt like spiritual highs or conviction moments where you felt like you were on the mountaintop. And what's so interesting about this one is this isn't at the end of the story. It's actually pretty close to before Jesus dies, before he's killed by other people. So to see that we're kind of confronted with these mountaintop experiences are important, but you don't stay there, that they prepare you in a sense for what comes next. Because what comes next, we have a really difficult scene. So if we go ahead on to verses 14 through 21, this is an interesting one where a man comes and he has a son who has epilepsy. He's suffering, it says, and the disciples weren't able to heal him. So what jumps out to you as you look at this and in that context of looking at it right after the Transfiguration?
Yeah, I think the overall message that's so important here is that Jesus doesn't stay on the mountaintop and doesn't want his followers to stay on the mountaintop. That while they are glorying in the glory of God on the mountaintop, there is terrible suffering going on in the valley in the life of this little boy who is seized by a terrible disease in which he has no control over his body, the turmoil in his father who feels so helpless, the turmoil in Jesus' own disciples who'd been trying to deal with this problem and failed over and over again. And so they must be frustrated and guilty and all. So this is a real, I think from the glory of the mountaintop to the gory of the valley. Mm-hmm. And we've got to do that too. I think mountaintop experiences are good for us, and worship is important for us. And singing our praises to God, it's exhilarating and very important. But we've got to remember that all the time that we are basking in the glow of God's love and mercy for us, other people are suffering spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, and physically. Mm-hmm. And that Jesus expects us, just like he expected his disciples, to follow him to dark, deep valleys.
The mountaintop isn't this isolated experience where we can be protected from all the other hardships.
Do you remember the old folk music group Peter, Paul, and Mary? Have you at least heard of them?
I don't know if I've heard of them. Sorry.
Well, that's okay. You don't have to know about it. Peter, Paul, and Mary were a very famous folk group.
Okay.
And Paul was a Jewish man who converted to faith in Jesus during his adult life. And he wrote a song, I won't quote the whole thing, but it kind of reflects on this. And I was wondering if you had been to the mountain to look at the valley below. Did you see all the roads tangled down in the valley? Did you know which way to go? The mountain streams run so pure and clear, I just wish to my soul I could always stay here. But there's a reason for living way down in the valley that only the mountain knows.
Wow, that's beautiful.
It's a beautiful song.
Yeah.
You'll be glad that I just recited it.
I want to hear you sing it now. Yeah, get out of next time.
No, I don't want to ruin it. We got a good thing going here. I don't want to ruin it by singing. At any rate, Paul Stuckey was the Paul of Peter, Paul, and Mary, and I think he really captured this moment. Well, that's the big picture, I think, of what's happening here. We probably ought to talk about
go into
a
the
few
specifics
details.
a little bit. Yeah. So you have this man come, and that there are a few characteristics that we want to notice about him. That he has a son who has epilepsy, and that Greek word tells us that he's struck by the moon. Is that it? Okay, that's how they thought of it.
Our word lunatic, that means moonstruck.
Okay.
And that's the word that's used
that's
here.
the word used. Wow.
Yeah. So it's a mysterious disease for ancient people, and it's still one that troubles people today. Yeah, I talked about just in what turmoil he would have been in, and that is true. I'm also amazed at his respect for Jesus. He kneels before him. It says in verse 14, he calls him Lord, and he says, "Have mercy on my son." He knows that God is a God of mercy and that Jesus is God's son and Jesus has come to show mercy. So this father really gets it in many ways, even though he feels helpless at the situation of his son. The other characters here are the disciples themselves. And while Jesus was on the mountain with Peter, James, and John, the rest of the disciples have been waiting in the valley. And they were the ones who originally asked to heal this young man. And we know that they have healed. I mean, Jesus sent them out to preach and teach and heal and cast out demons. And they evidently did that, all four of those things. But here they were unsuccessful. It says at the end of verse 16, but they could not cure him. They couldn't do it. And so Jesus, once again, uses this phrase, "O ye of little faith," meaning that he would have expected them to respond more successfully to this. It's interesting. Jesus is always teaching, but he's always expecting his followers to carry out his teachings. Remember with the feeding of the 5,000, they come to Jesus and say, Jesus, we got to do something about these hungry people. And Jesus' response was, yeah, right. You give them something to eat.
Feed them. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
And so here, Jesus seems to have expected them to be able to handle this situation in his authority. And for whatever reason, he says, because of your little faith.
So when he says because of your little faith, he's talking to the disciples specifically. Is that how you take it?
Yeah, okay. Definitely. I'm in verse 19. The disciples came to him. See, this is after the healing.
Okay.
The disciples came to him privately afterwards and said, why couldn't we do it? And he said, because of your little faith.
So one thing I want to clarify then, so we see that, if you look up in verse 16, he talks about you faithless and perverse generation. So is that to everyone? Is there a difference there?
I don't know.
Okay.
I do know that statement that you just read from verse 17 immediately follows what I quoted a minute ago from the end of 16. But they could not cure him, referring to the disciples.
Okay.
And then Jesus says, kind of in frustration, oh, what a faithless and perverse generation. How much longer am I going to have to put up with you guys? And I'm not 100% sure. I guess if I had to lean one way or the other, he's talking about his followers.
Okay, yeah. So it could be broader, could be more
And
specific.
this is a very exaggerated language. When he calls them faithless and perverse, he doesn't mean they had no faith. Obviously, they've just confessed that Jesus is the Son of the living God. So he is frustrated in their inability to act in his name. So, yeah, we kind of skipped over the climax in some ways. In verse 18, the boy was cured because of the ministry of Jesus. But then Jesus quickly turns his attention back to the disciples, as he always does, and uses this as a teachable moment to say, it's all about faith. It's not about your ability to heal. It's based on faith. Faith in me. So we learn, I think, a couple of important things here. One is that Jesus cared about every aspect of human existence. We've seen that before.
Yeah, he cares about this boy and what he's struggling with.
Yeah. And what this boy is struggling with is physical discomfort, maybe some kind of psychological or spiritual, because they refer to a demon. Certainly sociological dysfunction. He would have been difficult to have friends or interact with family or other people. So, besides the physical malady itself, Jesus once again demonstrates that he cares about every aspect of human existence. But the other thing I think we take away from this story for ourselves is that it's so tempting to to face a challenge that we know it's a problem, and we think that we just need to let God take care of that. And I understand the power of God. I believe in the power of God, and I understand the authority of Jesus, and I believe in the authority of Jesus. But it's so tempting just to step back and say, well, I can't really do anything about that. Oh, Jesus will have to. There's so many challenges in the world today, and I'm afraid that I, as a Christian, and the church in general, tend to kind of back out and just, the whole thoughts and prayers phenomenon. And with Jesus, it's not just thoughts and prayers; it's thoughts and prayers and actions in faith. And
we trust that those actions will be multiplied through Jesus.
Yeah. Like the feeding stories and all. So I think we need to be challenged by this story. We need to be comforted by the power of Jesus to heal in all areas of human need. But we also need to accept the challenge to minister in Jesus' name when we're confronted with problems.
Okay.
I'm going to tell you a story.
Okay.
We got a dog when our sons were small, And it was a pretty big dog, and it was going to be an outdoor dog. And so we needed a doghouse. And my father was a really good carpenter. I'm not especially good. I'm a good carpenter's helper, but not a real good carpenter. And he had frequently come to the homes where we lived when we had little remodeling projects or something like that. And so I thought, we need a doghouse, and my father's recently retired. I'm just going to call him and get him and Mom to drive down here and spend a week with us or something. He can build a doghouse while he's here, and that'll be great, and the boys will love that. So I actually went in and picked up the telephone. This was so long ago, there were actual telephones. That
you picked it up,
picked up that kind of
That's
telephone.
Not that long ago, yeah.
And started to, here's how long ago this was, dial his number, and then it hit me. He had died about a month before that moment.
Wow.
And I put the phone back down, and I went into the bedroom of our sons and said, you guys come with me. We're going to go build a doghouse, just like Grandpa would have. Mm-hmm. And as I've reflected on that moment over the years, I've realized that's a spiritual phenomenon that I face too sometimes, where my tendency is to always say, Jesus, you'll take care of this, or God, you'll do this. I know, and you're the ones with the power. When sometimes we need to take action, trusting in God's power and in the power of our faith in Jesus.
That God has equipped us to do what's before us.
Maybe. Okay.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you
All
for
right.
sharing that.
All right.
Yeah. That's the next story we have. We go on to, in verses 22 through 23, that there's another prediction of Jesus' death. He says, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into human hands. They will kill him. On the third day he will be raised. And they were greatly distressed. And we've seen this before in the last chapter. And we've seen it again when they were on the mountaintop as well. So that we keep hearing these predictions coming up. Is there anything you want to add to that?
No, there's nothing new here except for the fact that this is the third time that we know that Jesus made a very clear prediction. Could be he talked about it even more than that, but they're the ones that get recorded.
Enough
in
to
the
write
Gospels.
it down 3 times.
Yeah, it's written 3 times.
Okay.
And so the disciples should not have been surprised by what happens when they finally get to Jerusalem. But they just couldn't accept it until they couldn't accept the reality of the crucifixion, and they had a hard time imagining the reality of the resurrection. So it's one of those situations which they're not going to believe it till they see it.
It almost makes you wonder, they're writing this later in retrospect where they're like, oh yeah, he did tell us multiple times this is going to happen.
That's true.
And that they recorded it.
Yeah,
and then
true.
we finally go into verses 24 through 27, a short little story here. It's kind of an odd story. This is the only time it's captured in any of the Gospels that they ask, the collectors ask Peter about the temple tax. So what is that tax? What's going on in this story?
This has nothing to do at all with the Roman taxation.
Okay.
We've already talked about the fact that Romans taxed the people in 2 ways. Every year they had to pay a tax just for living in the Roman Empire. And every time they carried produce along a road, they had to pay what we might call a tariff, or an excise tax, on the value of that produce that they were moving around. And that's the kind of tax collector Matthew was.
Okay.
So those are Roman taxes. This is something completely different. This goes way, way back into Exodus, the book of Exodus, where the people were instructed that they were to bring an annual tax to the tabernacle, later on the temple, for the upkeep of the tabernacle, its furnishings, its materials, its the priests who presided there, a temple tax of half a shekel a year just to maintain the worship space. And we read about it in Exodus, we read about it again in 2 Chronicles after they built the temple. And so that's what that was, half a shekel per person.
Okay.
Now, it could be that Matthew was interested in this story because, as you said, he's the only gospel writer to tell us about this, because for 2 reasons. One, it took place in Capernaum, which was Matthew's hometown. and it's about taxation, which was something that Matthew was into.
And it's interesting, we see here that they come to Peter. They ask, does your teacher not pay the temple tax? And he says, yes, he does. That's all he says. And you kind of, is he speaking on behalf of Jesus? Do you think he actually knows the answer here?
Let me point out to you, in the actual original text of this, it doesn't say, yes, he does.
Okay.
It says, yes.
So he's
It's
keeping
kind
it
of
vague.
it's an
Yeah.
ambiguous answer. Because their question is, Jesus doesn't pay the temple tax, does he? And he
Yes.
says, yes. And so does that mean yes he does or yes he doesn't? So he's kind of doing it. So then they come to Jesus and say, oh, what about this, Jesus? Should we be paying the temple tax? And Jesus gives a really interesting double answer. Now, it's a double answer, but it's not an ambiguous answer.
Okay.
First, he tells them a little parable. He says, who pays taxes to a king? Do the sons of the king? Does the heir of the king? No. The other people that he's conquered, they're the ones that pay the taxes. So, should I, the Son of God, pay a tax to the temple of God, who is my Father, as the Son of God? And the implicit answer is no. I don't need to. So I don't really feel responsible to pay this tax, Jesus says. Then the second part of it is, but I'm not here just to offend people and to run, over people's convictions and practices and customs and things like that. So, yeah, let's just pay the tax. So he recommends that they go ahead and do that. I find that very interesting because I think there's certain things that Christians do that their culture does, things that don't violate their Christian conscience, but they still don't really have to do them. But they do it so as not to give offense. I can think of two Bible examples. One is, Paul said, you know what? Jesus never said a word about women having to wear head coverings. There's no word in the teaching of Jesus. But in Corinth, the only women who don't wear head coverings are temple priestesses, pagans.
Yeah.
And you don't want to be you don't want to be
don't be
associated with them.
associated.
Yeah. So tell you what, let's just go along with that custom, even though we know Jesus didn't mandate it.
Yeah.
That's one example. Another is Paul, when Timothy joined him as a young associate on a missionary journey. Paul had him circumcised. Now, Paul had just recently vehemently argued against the necessity of circumcision for salvation. So he didn't believe that circumcision was necessary for Christians, but he knows they're going to be ministering among Jews. So he says, you know what? We don't want to give offense to the Jews that we're trying to reach for Jesus. So let's go ahead and do that circumcision thing. So
I love what you said, it's kind of funny to read. We don't want to give offense to them when we know Jesus very much did offend people at many other times. But you're right that there's a difference in, is he offending them for the sake of the gospel, in the sense of often he was offending the Pharisees and people who were kind of hurting the cause of the good news of Jesus Christ, versus here where it really isn't too big of a deal to make sure they pay this tax, to make sure they respect what head coverings might have symbolized, that there's a difference there. And we're called to live at peace with others and to see that we would be okay with realizing which practices we need to go along with for the sake of the gospel, rather than to just be obnoxious and offend other people.
yeah, it does take a lot of discernment at times to know which side to come down on. But as long as we're not violating our Christian conscience, and we can do some of these things that don't offend people.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for explaining that to us.
Okay.
That's good. So we've seen a lot in this chapter so far, and a lot of it's about identity as we take a look at this. You're kind of reminded even in that last passage that Jesus is the Son of God, and that's something we can take away from that too. We've seen that in the rest of this too, that how Jesus shows he's the Son of God on the mountaintop. We see his power showing up when he heals the boy with epilepsy as well. Are there any other things that you're noticing thematically, or takeaways for us rather today as we finish up with this chapter?
Yeah, I think we can look for opportunities to follow Jesus to the mountain for retreat, for worship, and then make sure that we don't feel like we have to live on the mountain all the time, that we're willing to take seriously the challenges of human need, knowing that Jesus has called us to, as far as possible, have the resolve to meet those needs around us in His name.
That's beautiful. Yeah. So I don't know if you're on the mountaintop today or if you're on the valley, wherever you might be, that we recognize that God is present in all of those things, but that in both of those places, that God is inviting us to be involved, to be a part of God's kingdom on earth. That's what we see with the disciples, that they weren't to sit back and wait for Jesus to work, but they were called to action. That discipleship isn't about being a spectator, but that you are very much a part of Jesus's work on earth. So I hope that we will prayerfully, with discernment, I love how you use that word, that we will move into that and work alongside with Jesus. That's what we have for us today in chapter 17. Come back with us next week as we discuss Matthew 18.